In the rough lands now called the Netherlands, there was once a king whose name still lives on today. His name was Redbad, the king of the Frisians. He was a leader known for his bravery, his fight against his enemies, and his deep love for his people and their freedom. In the 7th and early 8th centuries, the Frisian kingdom was doing well in the areas now known as parts of the Netherlands, Germany and Denmark. It was a time when Europe was full of different tribes and growing kingdoms, each creating their own future. The Frisians, known for their strong need for freedom, sailed the seas as traders, fighters and explorers. In this world, full of changes and challenges, Redbad became a symbol of hope and strength for his people. But why is Redbad's story important? Why does his name still live on in Frisia and other places? It's because Redbad stands for the spirit of fighting against huge challenges. His fights against the Frankish Empire were not just wars, they were a battle for his people's way of life, their beliefs and their freedom. Think about a place with strong winds and rough seas, where the tough spirit of the people matches the rugged land they live in. This is where Redbad was born, during a time when Frisia was a group of different families, each with their own tale, but all tied together by a common fate. We don't know much about Redbad's early life, just as we can't see much when our coastlines are covered by fog. He was born into a high-ranking family that had always protected Frisia's freedom and old ways. As a kid, Redbad learned all about his family's traditions and how to handle both sea travel and being a leader. As a young guy, he watched the older folks and learned about the fine line between fighting and peace and freedom and diplomacy. His life was full of constant danger, not just from nature, but also from the Frankish territories growing to the south. The events that led to Redbad becoming king show just how rough these times were. After his dad died, Frisia was at a turning point. They needed a leader who could steer them through the risky times of war and change. In Redbad, the Frisians saw not just a fighter but a source of hope. His becoming king wasn't just a title change, it was a call for unity and resistance. With the responsibility of being king, Redbad was ready to guide his people through one of the toughest times in their history. Think about how heavy that must feel, to have the hopes and worries of a whole kingdom on your shoulders. Redbad took on his role as king with the bravery of his family and a dream for Frisia's future, a future where his people wouldn't submit to foreign rulers and where their traditions would continue for many more years. King Redbad ruled a huge kingdom. It started from where the northern Netherlands is today, went across parts of Germany and ended in Denmark. This land was full of water, with big coastlines, rivers and islands. This was the heart of Frisia. The people there knew how to live with the sea, not fight against it. The people from Frisia were different, just like their land. There were farmers, traders and warriors. They all had important parts to play in the life of Frisia. They were tied together by their spirit of not wanting to be ruled by anyone else. The way they together was very community-based. Families and groups would meet at local markets, not just to trade things, but they would also share stories, rules and traditions. The Thing, a meeting of free men, was really important for the politics of Frisia. It was a place where they would sort out arguments and make decisions that affected everyone. They would vote on these decisions. The Frisians were full of tradition. They would tell stories around fires during the winter. These stories were about the myths of their ancestors, stories about gods and heroes. These stories showed how much they loved nature and how close to the gods they felt. Redbad was at the center of this kingdom. He was more than just a king. He brought the Frisian people together. He was a symbol of how much the Frisians wanted to keep their identity, their customs and their freedom. Imagine living in a time when your land, your culture and your life were always in danger. This was life for the Frisians under Redbad. But even though life was hard, they did well. They stayed strong and became closer as a community. But this time of peace and success did not last. As we move on to the next part of our story, we see Frisia and its king about to face a big fight. They were up against enemies that could change their world forever. As King Redbad's kingdom grew, a problem was coming. The growing Frankish Empire, wanting to show its power, was a big worry for Frisia's freedom. The Franks, with their pushy leaders, wanted to take over the Frisian lands. They didn't just want to rule, they wanted to change their religion too. Everything was ready for a big fight between different ways of living, thinking, and armies. Redbad was strong, standing tall against the coming danger. He knew how important freedom was and how much his people's way of living mattered. It wasn't just about land, it was about who the Frisians were. The Battle of Dorstad was really important in this fight. Dorstad, at a key spot on the river, was more than just a town. It was a symbol of how strong and successful Frisia was. Redbad got this. His plans weren't just about fighting, they were about keeping Frisia safe. Under Redbad's leadership, the Frisians fought hard, just like the rough seas that touched their lands. Each fighter, loving their homeland so much, was ready to give their life for their children's freedom. Even though the war went up and down, Redbad's steady strength never changed. The Battle of Dorstad was not just proof of his great strategy skills, but his steady promise to keep his people free. Imagine being on that battlefield in the middle of the noise and confusion, fighting not just for the land you're standing on, but for who you are. This was the heavy load King Redbad had, a load he held with bravery and honor. After the battle, a different kind of fight started, one that challenged who the Frisians were. King Redbad's next big fight would not be with swords, but with faith and strength of mind. In a time when big changes were happening in Europe, one man stood strong against them. King Redbad, a leader who strongly believed in the old ways of his family, faced a new type of attack, not from soldiers, but from different religious ideas. To Redbad, the gods of Frisia were not just stories. They were as real as the ground beneath his feet, as important as the air his people breathed. These beliefs affected everything in Frisian life, from the change of seasons to what happens to souls after death. The arrival of Christian missionaries in Frisia was a danger not just to Redbad's rule, but to the entire way of life in Frisia. The new religion, with its offer of life after death, wanted to wipe out hundreds of years of tradition and belief. Faced with the everlasting promise of Christianity, Redbad found himself having to make a difficult decision. It was at this moment he said the words that would be remembered forever. "I would rather live with my ancestors in the mists of hell than go to heaven with a crowd of beggars." This wasn't just resistance, it was a statement of who he was, a refusal to give up his people and their ways. Imagine standing on the edge of forever, trying to decide between the unknown and the traditions that make you who you are. Redbad's decision not to be baptized was not a rejection of life after death. It was a show of his loyalty to his ancestors and their heritage. This of saying no was a big change, not just for Redbad, but for all of Frisia. It was a stand against the wiping out of their culture, a shining example of the importance of religion, tradition, and identity. As the battle for the spirit Frisia went on, Redbad's leadership became even more important. His battles were not only fought on the battlefield and in the spiritual world, but also through making friends with other leaders and the careful management of relationships. In a world full of fights and power struggles, King Redbad knew that having a strong army wasn't enough to make a kingdom powerful. He knew that making friends with other tribes and kingdoms was just as important. This was not just about politics, but about survival. He wanted to keep his people, the Frisians, safe from other powerful groups who wanted to control them. Imagine how risky it must have been for the Frisians to travel to new places to make these friendships. Each friend they made was like a piece in a big puzzle that helped them survive in the tough times of early medieval Europe. These friendships were more than just strategies. They were promises to protect each other. When one kingdom was in danger, the others would help. Redbad's smart moves showed that he knew working together was the best way to avoid being controlled by others. Thanks to Redbad, the Frisians didn't have to face threats alone. The friendships he made helped them stay safe, and their way of life could continue even when times were hard. This was a time when they didn't just survive, but did well. And it wasn't just because they were good fighters, but because they were good at making friends. The things Redbad did still matter today. They remind us that working together is the best way to stay strong. When times are tough, it's our friends who help us get through. As we think about the end of Redbad's life, we see how much his rule affected the world. The friends he made, the fights he had, and the culture he protected all helped build a legacy that would outlive him. Every story has an ending, and so did the tale of King Redbad, the brave leader of Frisia. At the end of his rule, he fought his last battle, not against enemies or the sea, but against time itself. We don't know much about how he died, but it's said that he died bravely, just like he lived. His death was the end of a time, but the start of a story that people would remember for years to come. After he was gone, the next rulers didn't just take his place as king, but also took on his fight. The kingdom he left behind showed how tough he was, as it still stood strong, even with the threat of powerful enemies. We can't measure how much King Redbad helped Frisia and its people in the long run.